afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Swanson, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to our virtual expert roundtable discussion today, Perspectives on Gun Violence in America, sponsored by the Wilson Center for Science and Justice here at Duke Law School, the Duke Center for Firearms Law, and my home department, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in our School of Medicine here at Duke. I'm delighted as well to welcome our distinguished panel today. I'll say a little more about each of them when I ask them some questions, but just briefly, we have Dr. Mark Rosenberg, formerly Assistant Surgeon General of the United States in the Public Health Service, my colleague, Professor Philip Cook from Duke University, Professor and Vice Dean Cami Chavis from the William & Mary Law School, Professor Josh Horowitz from Johns Hopkins, and Cheryl Gay Stolberg from the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. The epidemic of gun violence in the United States is a complicated, multifaceted problem that claimed nearly 47,000 lives in 2023, and more than half of them suicides, and together accounting for more than 1 million potential years of life lost. Firearm injuries and deaths touch countless others, as we all know, from bereaved family members to whole communities suffering the collective loss and trauma and fear of everyday gun violence. And yet, in a nation where the private ownership of firearms is commonplace, culturally rooted, and constitutionally protected, given the way our Supreme Court has interpreted the right to bear arms and the Second Amendment of the Constitution, our efforts to prevent gun violence must balance public safety goals with individual rights and other considerations. Neighboring academic disciplines and practice fields bring distinct yet overlapping knowledge, experience, insights, and methods of inquiry to understand the causes of gun violence and how best to prevent it. For example, public health employs the toolkit of injury epidemiology, concepts such as individual risk and environmental exposure and counts of mortality and morbidity to take the measure of gun violence and define what counts as success in preventing it. Public policy, overlapping a bit with public health in this sphere, explores the guidelines of organizational action focused on the problem and what government chooses to do or not to do about gun violence through legislation and regulation, or the lack of it, animated by different notions of public value and often using economics to analyze resource allocations and costs. Criminology is focused more on law enforcement strategies and community safety. And we have the justice perspective that considers issues of equity and fairness and how to secure that in the application of the law. Advocacy employs grassroots efforts and listens to community voices to promote desired social change in this area. And politics, which we can't avoid, can involve conflict, competition for power, but it seeks consensus, we hope, between competing interests and using the levers of government to solve the gun violence problem. And then we have mass media that shapes our public perception and national discourse about the problem and its solutions, sometimes in very different and separated information markets. Now, we think that a broadened dialogue across these kinds of fields is what's needed to identify tensions, but also areas of complementarity. And I think by bringing together national experts and leaders, such as we have on our panel today, to examine gun violence through alternative lenses, maybe it'll help this discussion, Will, to foster some innovative solutions and collaborations that can help to mitigate this scourge of gun violence in America. And our goal is to move beyond isolated efforts towards a more unified and impactful approach. Now, there has been notable progress on the gun violence prevention front in recent years. Sometimes we're discouraged, we think nothing's happening. But for example, 21 states and the DC now have extreme risk protection orders, red flag laws, and lives are being saved by the application of those. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed in 2022 and provided significant funding for implementing ERPOs, as well as the National ERPO Resource Center. There's now a White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. There's substantial new funding for gun violence and suicide research from the NIH and CDC and other agencies, as well as private foundations. And what's really encouraging to me is a new generation of talented and well-trained researchers in the social sciences and public health, as well as legal scholars committed to working on this problem. And we have new attention being paid to addressing racial equity concerns, for example, in the creation of the Racial Equity Impact Assessment Tool for use by gun violence researchers. Now, all that being said, we have an elephant in the room today. We've just experienced what we might describe as an electoral earthquake in Washington. And I'd like to ask our panelists to honestly consider their remarks in this light. How do we think of the way forward together in an increasingly divided country in which solutions to gun violence that involve laws and legal tools and policies seem to be increasingly polarizing and even, you could say politically radioactive? It's just very difficult. I'll introduce each guest with a biographical note leading directly to a question that's designed to draw upon their particular expertise and experience. And I'll ask each of them in turn to reflect in that light on the contours of the gun violence problem and to share lessons that they've learned that could help us find our way closer to solving this incredibly complex problem that causes such tragedy and irreversible loss every day in America. So Dr. Mark Rosenberg, let's start with you. And by way of a little background, I should say Mark is our panelist with high-level experience as a federal public health official. Dr. Rosenberg oversaw gun violence research at the CDC in the 90s at a time when the ideological fault lines separating the gun rights and gun control movements were really sort of digging a canyon between these two sides and casting them not only as political opponents, but really as cultural adversaries who saw the world differently. And Mark, as the founding director of the CDC's Center for Injury Prevention and Control, was a very vocal advocate for the public health approach for studying gun violence and working towards evidence-based solutions. And in that role, he drew the ire of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, becoming something of a lightning rod for opposition to gun control at a time when the NRA's influence and political power in Washington was ascendant. So Mark, with all that, here's a question for you. Can you just tell us how you navigated that early patch of rough waters for the field of gun violence prevention, in your perch there at the CDC, and what lessons did you learn that might be applicable to gun violence researchers and policy scholars in the aftermath of the 2024 elections?
Thanks, Jeff. It's a tall order to give you that in 5 minutes, but let me try. Let me start with a little bit of background. In 1983, we started to look at violence as a public health problem. At that time, injuries were the leading cause of death in this country for people from 5 to 44, and they still are the leading cause of death for those people. There were two leading causes of injury death at that time. One was cars and the other was guns. And we looked at how people worked on motor vehicle injuries and saw that they had done a lot of research because there was an epidemic of young people dying on the roads in the 60s. And people had done very little research on gun violence prevention. So we said, let's try to organize and support that research through what we can do at CDC. And so we developed what we called the public health approach. And there were 3 pillars to that approach. The first is it was based on science. We said, know the truth. We've got to share the truth and avoid certainty, because if you think you're certain in what you know, you stop learning and you close yourself off to new information. So the first pillar was based on science. Second, it was focused on prevention. And third, it was collaborative. We tried to work with other disciplines, other parties, gun rights and gun safety proponents, and with people from the community, and try to learn from the perspective of those who suffer. So based on science, focused on prevention, and collaborative. Science, we basically said there are 4 simple questions. What's the problem? What are the causes? What works to prevent it? And how do you deliver it? How do you implement it and do it? We did not say that the public health approach was unique. Our science wasn't unique. It wasn't prevention that was unique, nor collaboration that was unique. But we tried to make the case that public health should be devoting resources and time to this problem. When we said it was a public health problem, we didn't mean it was only belonging to public health, but public health should get into this and contribute to the solution. Let me mention some lessons quickly. The first was avoid fatalism. As you said, we're making progress. We will continue to make progress. And the people and the quality of researchers and scientists and implementers is improving. There are more and more people coming to look at the problem, and we're going to solve this problem. We will. Avoid fatalism. Second, disinformation is rampant, and we need to help people understand how to recognize legitimate and valid science. When we started working, the NRA felt threatened by the work we were doing, and they developed a strategy that worked really well for them. They told their members and they told Congress and politicians that if our research were allowed to continue, it would result in all guns being taken away. If people worked in this field, all guns would be taken away. Everyone would lose all their guns. It wasn't true. It worked well for them, but it was disastrous for the country. My friend Jay Dickey taught me that we always need to start by addressing this and letting people know we're not going to take away their guns. We'll find solutions that both reduce gun violence and protect the rights of law-abiding gun owners. The third lesson is we lack the evidence and the information we need to fully understand how to prevent firearm injuries. We looked at what was spent on motor vehicle injuries from 1970 to 2024. It was over $10 billion. They started by investing $200 million in 1970, and the current value of that $200 million is $1.6 billion in 1 year alone. We're now spending $25 million at CDC, divided with NIH, and maybe DOJ spends an equal amount. We're not really starting to address the data problem seriously. The fifth information is, how do we bring the different disciplines together? We really need a unified field theory, or else we give way for other people who want to stop this research to say, it's this, no, it's that. It's mental illness, no, it's this. And you helped write a wonderful paper and have done wonderful research in this to show that mental illness is a minor player in this problem of gun violence deaths. Maybe 4% of all gun deaths would be stopped if we were able to cure all serious mental illness. Next lesson, we take a short-term view. We need to look at the long term to address the social and economic determinants of gun violence: poverty, lack of education, lack of access to jobs, racism. These are long-term changes we need to bring about. As long as we take just a short-term view, what we can solve in the length of time of one politician, we're not going to get there. Sixth, collaboration is hard, but we've got to do it. People somehow think it's easy to bring the disciplines together, easy to bring gun violence people together with gun rights people. It's hard, but it's worth doing. It's very important. Finally, we need a unified theory of gun violence prevention. How do we bring together what all of the disciplines know so that we can explain to people, here's the roadmap, here's the route forward. We need to be able to explain it not just to researchers, but to politicians and to citizens and community people. I think we're getting there, and I think this panel is an exciting start in approaching that. There's still many lessons I have to learn. There's still many lessons all of us are learning, but I hope this is at least a start in that direction, Jeff.
Thank you, Mark, for that wonderfully informative answer. Let's turn to Professor Cook. Professor Cook is an economist and a very distinguished award-winning public policy scholar here at Duke, who has made tremendous contributions to our understanding of the real cost of gun violence and gun-involved crime. Professor Cook has focused his research in recent years on law enforcement response to gun crime cases and the problem that a large proportion of assaults with firearms are never cleared by the police, especially in non-fatal incidents. So, Phil, here's a question for you in several parts. Does your research suggest that we need more investment in local policing to solve gun crimes and perhaps greater cooperation with the police from citizens in affected communities? What's the evidence that this would have an impact in reducing gun violence? Also, in the new political climate following the election, how do you think the idea of beefing up police capacity for investigating gun crimes will fare, say, compared to legal or regulatory reforms at the state level focused on preemptively reducing access to firearms by risky people? And how does a police-focused approach square with also trying to address the problem of discriminatory over-policing and mistrust of police in communities of color, for example? And you think this is an aspect of the gun violence problem that the public health field is also concerned about or should be?
So thanks, Jeff, and thanks to Mark Rosenberg for the terrific introduction to this conversation. I appreciate the call for coming together and bringing our different perspectives into sync. I started conducting research on gun violence and its prevention back in the 1970s, 50 years ago. And just despite my best efforts and of course the efforts of many other scholars, the broad trend in policy during that period has been toward deregulation, deregulation of commerce and deregulation of carrying firearms. The combination of the political power of the pro-gun factions and the court's radical interpretation of the Second Amendment suggests very little hope for reversing this trend anytime soon, I'm afraid, whatever the evidence might suggest. And in part for that reason, my focus in recent years has, as Jeff said, been on improving law enforcement. That appears more feasible to me, and the potential, in fact, is great, despite the fact that the public health researchers often give short shrift, I think, to law enforcement. Here is the context. The majority of all gunshot injuries are the result of one person shooting another in criminal circumstances. Gun violence is the leading crime problem in many cities, including my city of Durham, but also a long list of others that we could name. The police and the courts are clearly our primary capacity for responding to and controlling gun violence. And I need to hastily add that the police are far from perfect, but they are essential. The movement to defund the police, launched by the horrific murder of George Floyd in 2020, was never particularly popular in the communities that are most impacted by gun violence. Residents have a complex view of the police, often summarized as a sense of being both over-policed and under-policed. The under-policed belief follows naturally from the observation that so few shootings result in arrest and conviction. In Durham, for example, the percentage, including both fatal and non-fatal, is less than 10%. The same is true in Chicago, Baltimore, and many other cities. So less than 1 in 10 result in a conviction along the way. The result is that in these cities and others, one person can deliberately shoot another with what amounts to impunity, little chance of legal consequences. It's no wonder that gun violence prevention is a challenge. What is lost by this weak performance of the police and the courts is, first of all, justice. Victims have the right to expect that the authorities will be effective in solving serious crimes. It is demoralizing to see the shooters go free while the victims suffer, and there is a real possibility that the victim and associates may want to take matters into their own hands if the police fail to do their job. What is also lost by this weak performance is that it undermines the preventive effects of punishment. Conviction usually results in the incapacitation of the shooter, which, given the fact that shooters tend to recidivate, reduces subsequent shootings. And a higher rate of conviction would also have a deterrent value. Those who are tempted to settle a beef with their gun may think twice if they believe it will land them in prison. But there's not much reason to think that that's true under the current regime. there's considerable empirical evidence on these mechanisms that, and I would say overall it tends to contradict the oft-repeated view that the cops just clean up after the shooting, and what's really needed for prevention is to intervene before the shooting. In fact, the legal consequences of shootings, and in particular the likelihood of conviction, has a direct effect on the volume of subsequent shootings. Now, my research in recent years has focused on a particular aspect of this problem. I've found that the likelihood of arrest and conviction is far lower if the victim survives than if the victim is murdered. What I and others have found is that there are two types of explanation for this strange gap in arrest rates and conviction rates. And the explanations provide some guide, I think, to effective reform. First, the police put fewer resources into investigating non-fatal shooting cases and fatal shootings, despite the fact that they are circumstantially nearly identical. Investigators for the non-fatal cases often have heavy caseloads, far heavier than the homicide investigators, and hence little time for each case. Interestingly, the Denver Police Department recognized this as an opportunity a few years ago and created a new investigation unit that focused just on non-fatal shooting cases with resources equivalent to the homicide squad. The results so far appear very promising, and it's getting a lot of attention. The second explanation is that the victim of a non-fatal shooting often refuses to cooperate with the investigation and may even try to obstruct it. Without a cooperating victim, the police believe it's futile to proceed. District attorneys rarely are willing to prosecute cases in which the victim is not cooperating. And what I think on the positive side is that the opportunity here is multifaceted. The goal is to overcome the victim's fear of retaliation, distrust of police, and belief that nothing can be done. And if we can find levers to create that result, then cooperation would improve, conviction rates would improve. There's much more to be said about strengthening the criminal justice role in prevention as well as justice. And if I'm permitted a small plug, let me refer you to my new book with Anthony Braga, Policing Gun Violence, which has some of the answers and a lot of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was fascinating. So let's move to Professor Cami Chavis, law professor and vice dean at William & Mary. She directs a Center of Criminal Justice Policy and Reform. Professor Chavis has thought a great deal and thoughtfully written for the Legal Academy about racial inequality and disparities that precipitate from a discriminatory exercise of police authority and criminal prosecution in the United States. She serves on the steering committee of the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearms Policy, along with Josh and myself and some others. So here's my question for Professor Chavis, and I think this is a segue from Professor Cook's opening reflections as well. And the question is, when viewed through a racial equity lens, do you see a potential conflict between robust enforcement of gun laws, especially gun trafficking laws, and including stiffer penalties for breaking such laws, and the goal of reducing mass incarceration in this country? And can you describe some sustainable reforms in the criminal justice system for which you would advocate that might also help to reduce gun violence while supporting goals of reducing disparities in the system? And how do you think such reforms might fare in the political climate we face in the coming years?
Great. Thank you. And thank you for having me as part of this conversation. And so just as a direct answer to your question, yes, I think there is a tension between the stiffer penalties that many are calling for and reducing mass incarceration. However, I don't think it's a dichotomy, right, that's mutually exclusive. I don't think we have to choose between addressing gun violence and reducing mass incarceration. So first, I mean, I'll just say that gun violence, and others have said said this, gun violence is a racial justice issue. And I'll get to some of the statistics and disparities in a moment. But we also know that we're at a time and place where many are calling for expansive legal rights, expanded ownership and carrying expansions in that space. But at the same time, these rights are also not evenly dispersed. There are many proponents of these expansive rights are silent when law-abiding members of African-American community are legally carrying weapons, but then become victims of police violence. So we have, there's that conversation to be had. And finally, when we're thinking about stiffer penalties for gun crimes, we can absolutely expect to see racial disparities in enforcement. Just because you're looking for a weapon doesn't mean you're going to find a weapon, but then now someone has been caught up in the criminal justice system. So, and we know that there are racial disparities at every single aspect of the criminal justice system, from arrest to charging. Black individuals, African-American individuals are arrested more often, charged more often, and charged harsher charges, and then are sentenced more harshly for the same crimes than their white counterparts. So, so there is a tension. When we think about some of the disparities, I do want to point out, just in general, even though we've seen a surge, we saw a surge in gun homicides, 45%, right, between 2019 and 2021, we are starting to see declines. In 2023 and 2024, we've seen gun homicides decline. That is not true for communities of color. There are still Black Americans have experienced a 48% increase in gun homicides since 2019. So it's this elephant in the room. There's a couple elephants in the room, but one of them is that there is a racial disparity or a racial aspect to this. So even though gun violence is a universal threat, it is visited disproportionately on Black Americans. But people, when we're thinking about these tensions, victims, right? So Black people in the United States are more than twice as likely to die from gun violence, and more than 14 times likely than white people to be wounded by guns. So a Black person is, again, over 10 times more likely from a white person to die by a firearm homicide. So the dimension here is real. So we have this tension between marginalized communities as victims, and then also being disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and facing harsher sentences. And there's nowhere more apparent. If for folks who have read the amicus briefs in the Bruen case, in that Second Amendment case, we see the defense bar in New York talking about their clients as, you know, this having fewer penalties will lessen incarceration rates. And then, but we have the NAACP on the other side saying, but wait a minute, we have these communities are more likely to be victims. And so this tension here is real. I want to cut, when we think about solutions, I really just want to cut to the punchline and say that stiffer penalties and a harsher criminal justice response, I don't think that's the way to go. I don't mean to suggest that if someone who's been convicted of a homicide shouldn't face a penalty for that. I am talking about other penalties and things on the front end. There are things that we can do outside of the criminal justice system to actually prevent the harms that are being caused. And there's over the last few years, I'm particularly concerned when I think about I hear some folks talking about, well, like mandatory minimums and things like that for if you commit a crime, or if you're found with a weapon, there's a mandatory minimum for that. This is one area where we know that mandatory minimums have really contributed to mass incarceration in general, but Black communities bear a disproportionate weight of these mandatory minimums. They're 58% of all arrests with mandatory minimums, and 59% of all convictions with mandatory minimums have been African-American individuals. Again, we can look at felony data on, or federal data on felony misdemeanor convictions from 2017, 2020, 2021, Black men received sentences 13% longer than white men convicted of the same crimes. So when I hear, oh, we want to have stiffer penalties in this space, that is a concern. So I would advocate focusing on some things that we know can prevent gun violence in the first place. And part of that, we can look to what the current presidential administration has done. 2022, the enacting the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This gave lots of funding, over $250 million for community-based violence prevention, and the establishment of the Office of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. This is a baby office, just a little over a year old, and this office is worked with the Department of Labor to think about job training programs, worked with the Department of Health and Human Services. Surgeon General declared gun violence a public health crisis. And so this leads to more funding and more investment and for researching and studying these issues. So Jeff, you asked about in our current political climate, what may happen. And again, I think that we've already seen with Project 2025, it's all there with in terms of what how this new administration may focus on more officers, right? So hiring more police officers and cracking down on crime. There may be room for that, but what about the training for those officers and de-escalation and cultural competencies? Like those things, I think we're not going to see. And I think it's what one of the professors mentioned this, that communities of color is a very complex relationship. It's not that communities of color don't want to be safe. It's not that they don't want police. They just want to be policed differently and in a constitutional manner. So I think that in our the current climate, or what we may be looking forward to, is there's a lot of funding in that bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and supposed to go through at least 2026. I think that we're going to see a lot of that funding shifted away from these crime prevention programs and shifted to, perhaps hiring more officers. But what does that hiring look like? And then finally, most of my scholarship, this is going back to what Professor Cook mentioned about how do we actually solve these, if we have a homicide, how do we solve these homicides? We have to do something about the clearance rates. And if you don't trust police officers, if we're going to hire more police officers and we're not going to make sure that they are accountable to the community, then we're not going to have the trust that communities need to work in partnership with these entities. So I think there's a lot that we can do outside of the criminal justice system. I think the jury is out as to if we will be able to continue having the funding and the resources necessary to do that over the next few years.
Thank you, Professor Chavis. That was such an illuminating and nuanced answer. I appreciate that very much. And so let's turn to my friend, Professor Josh Horowitz, a nationally recognized leader and educator in the field of advocacy for public policies and legal tools to prevent gun violence. Josh has a long history of working with grassroots advocates at the state and local level to motivate and to mobilize public action in support of evidence-based legislative solutions to prevent gun violence. And he really steered the effort to convince lawmakers in 19 states and the DC to pass extreme risk protection order laws. It's a real triumph in this area. And then he worked effectively to think about implementation to ensure that that a really divided Congress could pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022, all the fruit of a real decade of labor of sticking with this. And yet, as Josh knows probably better than anybody from personal experience, there are powerful countervailing political forces afoot today that would seek to undo some of this progress and stall the research that's needed to fuel implementation, whether through constitutional litigation in the courts after the Bruen decision, or sort of regressive gun rights legislation, deregulation, or cutting appropriations of federal funding for gun violence research. So my question for you, Josh, is what lessons have you learned from your experience in successful advocacy and collaboration that people who really care about gun violence could employ in the current political era? Are you pessimistic about progress, in gun violence prevention at the federal legislative and policy level? Are you maybe more optimistic about action at the state level? And what do you think are the implications of like if we have sort of federal gun policy gridlock? Is that the end, or does that animate resistance or compromise at the state level when you think about advocacy?
Well, thanks for having me. This is a great panel. I can't wait for some of the crosstalk to go back and forth. So I'll get on my question, but then I got a million questions for everybody else. So it's such an interesting topic. But thank you so much for having me. So you started by asking me, how does my experience inform what I do right now, and how does that inform other folks? And so there's two things that I want to bring up today. One is, and although this isn't a game, it's a long game, right? It's a long process. I've been doing this for 35 years and I'm still optimistic. I've been, during certain times in my career, it's been very, very difficult to move things. And at certain times you've had a lot of success. The success is based on toiling in the vineyard in the unsuccessful times and working hard and laying the groundwork and doing the research and building the coalitions. So I think you have to think through that. And in this time we have, yes, this election may be a setback for our issue. I think it probably is. But you also have to think about where we are now. And so how did this issue play out in the election? When I started, in the late 80s, early 90s, you could barely talk about this issue politically. Every party ran away from you. I recall Democratic legislators, when I work in the state house sometimes in Virginia, I'm not kidding you, hide under their desks. Like they actually did that, right? So that we didn't have to answer. Maybe they wanted to help, but they felt they couldn't. I'm not sure, but it's so different now, right? So you have, yes, firearms are always, an issue in national elections, but not the intensity that it was in the past. And you have many, we tend to look at this as well, Harris lost, Trump won, therefore Trump agenda is the way to go. But you also have, it's interestingly, Democratic senators in a lot of swing states who are very supportive of gun violence prevention. One ran ahead of Harris. So I just looked, for instance, at, Elissa Slotkin's gun violence prevention policy. And it's great, right? And so she wins re-election in that state. And, in the past, if you asked me 30 years ago, you would never get these senators talking the way they do now and winning. So I think, it's gun violence prevention is not the third rail, although we are going to go into a challenging circumstance. There's no doubt about that. And when you go into a challenging circumstance, you have to think about, and as you mentioned, I teach advocacy. What are the levers that are available to you, right? When things are tough, when everything's going your way, maybe you have all the levers, but and things aren't going your way, what are the levers that are still available? I just want to briefly talk about that for advocates. And also, as we get back into the bigger conversation, when the levers I'm talking about span across public health, criminal justice, and criminal justice reform and equity. These all in many ways go together. And I think you have to think about each lever in those terms. So thinking first, yes, I think Congress is going to be a very difficult place to work in. It's going to be a very difficult place for lots of issues. And Congress has never been an easy place to work in the gun violence prevention space. This will not be different. It might be harder. My worry, if you ask me, my big worry is, will the filibuster stand? In other words, will you still need to have 60 votes to pass substantive legislation, in the United States Senate? I think that's going to hold, but it's not off the who knows? But I do think it's important for many things and for our democracy that as we've used the filibuster for the last number of decades, that we continue that power is be there, because that helps bring compromise to the U.S. Senate. And I think that's an important thing. If that were to fall, that would be a different story. I would be much more pessimistic on a federal level. We talked about, and Mark talked about the type of funding that we have and the funding that's available. And Cammie mentioned the Safer Communities Act. I worry that that's in jeopardy. The thing that I think is my biggest worry is the CDC, the NIH money, the NIJ money that's gone to really incredible research. And when we think about gun violence prevention, it's gone, it's such a big field. It's gone to think about how to make communities that Cammie was just describing safer, but it's also, we also see it going into issues like rural suicide and how, and how healthcare providers can work with their patients to lock their firearms. It goes to a breadth of different types of solutions. So when you think, oh, I'm going to stop this funding, it's not just policy funding. You're talking about major problems across the entire United States, including suicide, that you're cutting funding off to understand. So I think that's something that's extremely important. The other lever that's going to be difficult is federal executive action. So we've seen things like, this administration working on rules on ghost guns and bump stocks and ATF enforcement. I think that's going to be much more difficult, and unfortunately difficult in the next administration. But that doesn't mean the governors can't pick up some of those enforcements, and they can think about executive actions in their own states, as well as, I'll get into some state stuff in just a second. I know we're time limited. One of the most important levers and interesting levers is the Supreme Court. And we know with the Bruen decision that's been discussed today, it created a new framework for Second Amendment jurisprudence it may be much more difficult. It's based in history and tradition. But when the Fifth Circuit considered a case where the Fifth Circuit said, well, domestic abusers can now have firearms. People who have been under domestic violence restraining orders have been prevented under federal law. The Fifth Circuit said that's a violation of the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court said, whoa, whoa, whoa. I know you read Bruen that way, but hey, let's not go off the ledge here. An 8-1 decision said that you can prevent domestic abusers from having firearms. And I think the Roberts Court is actually intent, I think, saying we got way too close to the cliff with the Bruen decision. They've sent a whole bunch of cases out for reconsideration that were on their docket. And I'm hopeful that we will get some return to more rationality in the Supreme Court. So that's a lever that I think we need to focus on. But of course, it's the states. It's the states where I've spent a lot of time working with. We have states across the country who have focused this. You mentioned on the extreme risk protection order work that I've done, but background checks, safe storage, what we call permit to purchase or handgun purchase or licensing. This is a really right place for thinking about policy, but it's beyond policy. It's program and it's implementation. And when we're thinking about saving lives, you have to think about that as well. What are the types of community violence intervention programs we can work at now, and also the implementation? And that goes across. It's equitable implementation. It's better implementation of laws by law enforcement. It's also thinking about how courts implement laws. So you're thinking about ways to save lives. Better implementation enforcement around our domestic violence laws would save a lot of lives. So I just want to throw that out there. And the reason that I think this will have to change is that when you look at 2022 or 2022 data, you look at the difference in policy and programs between the different states. Massachusetts has a lot of programs and policy we're talking about. Mississippi has nothing like that, no state laws on this issue. And for young people, be age from the ages of 1 to 19, the firearm death rate in Mississippi is 15 times higher than it is in Massachusetts. And so we have to do something about this, and we will do something about this.
Thank you, Josh. I'm reminded of something that our friend Daniel Webster says from time to time, which is if you're tempted to be discouraged, think about this, that more than half the country now lives in a state with stronger and more sensible gun laws than was the case 10 years ago. Even if it doesn't look like at the federal level, a whole lot has happened, but much has happened. Okay, so this is great. We're going to turn now to our cleanup batter and our professional question asker. Cheryl Gay Stolberg is going to hit the home run here, as she's a veteran Washington correspondent for the New York Times covering health policy and politics. She has covered Congress and the White House and is currently writing a book on the history of politics and public health and the accelerating decline in trust in public health governance and its underlying science. Her forthcoming book for Random House has the provocative, if tentative title of Contagion of Mistrust, When the Culture Wars Came for Public Health. And I understand the book will have a chapter on the modern history of gun control, the debate as it affected government-sponsored public health research in gun violence back to the days of Mark Rosenberg at the CDC. So Cheryl Gay Stolberg, as you listened to these other panelists and applying your knowledge of the causes and consequences of politicization of public health in other areas analogous to gun violence, what lessons would you apply, or what suggestions would you offer to the rest of us as researchers and practitioners in this area in the current climate in Washington? And I think you suggested when we talked about this that evidence-based gun violence prevention work could continue and even succeed, maybe even flourish under this era of Republican control in Washington, perhaps by nudging more liberal-minded gun violence experts and researchers to engage more seriously with what you call gun culture. So let me just ask you to elaborate on that, or answer any of those questions for us.
So first of all, I just want to say I'm so honored to be with this panel. Everyone is, it's such an esteemed group. I appreciate being included. So we're obviously in a new political climate in Washington, or maybe a new old political climate in Washington. I thought it would be useful to just take a quick spin through history, which Josh alluded to. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed an assault weapons ban into law. Democrats promptly got their heads handed to them in the midterm elections. We had the Gingrich Revolution. A lot of Democrats thought that the gun issue was responsible for their losses. The Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, a pro-gun rights Democrat, lost his seat. 10 years later, I covered the expiration of the assault weapons ban, and Democrats really were running from this issue. But in 2018, actually in the middle of the first Trump administration, we had a sea change, and Democrats like Lucy McBath and Jason Crow and Alyssa Slotkin got elected to the House. These were moderate centrist Democrats who were nonetheless willing to run on a platform of safer gun laws. So now we're in a situation where we have both houses of Congress under control by Republicans. We've got what you would call a Republican trifecta in Washington, and Trump is going to have a stronger hand this time around. So whatever policies are going to be enacted, at least at the federal level, will have to have Republican support. And I thought it would be useful to think a little bit about Trump and who he is. And we know a few things. Trump actually doesn't have any real ideology. And he has, surprisingly enough, on occasion showed himself to be open to working across party lines. He signed the First Step Act, a criminal justice reform bill, in 2018. It was aimed at ending or at least reducing the mass incarceration problem. It was supported by both the Koch brothers and Bernie Sanders. And I think this time around, we're likely to see some of that liberal left, libertarian right convergence. I'm seeing that already in RFK, Trump's nominee for health secretary, about whom I've been writing a lot. Trump's actions and comments on gun violence have been kind of all over the place. During the first Trump administration, he held a meeting at the White House to address gun violence, and he asked, well, why can't you just take guns away from violent people? And Mike Pence piped up and he said, well, sir, we have to worry about due process, so no one's rights are trampled. And Trump said, well, I like taking the guns early. Let's just, take the firearms first and do the due process later. So at the same time, though, Trump signed legislation rolling back some of the regulations that Obama put into place that would have, for instance, added people receiving Social Security checks for mental illness to the background database. Trump has also blamed gun violence on mental illness. And Mark, you stole my thunder. I was going to mention Dr. Swanson's work. We know that if we cured schizophrenia, we'd have a 4% reduction in gun violence in this country. So we talked earlier about the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I would bet that Trump eliminates it, if only because it's something that Biden and Harris put into place. Trump has already forecast this. He's said, quote, every single Biden attack on gun owners and manufacturers will be terminated on my very first day, first week back into office. Though I would note that the money that office is overseeing from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is appropriated by law. Then we have Bobby Kennedy, the nominee for health secretary. He has said that antidepressants and video games are responsible for gun violence. Yet he's also said that he would like to see government research on gun violence prevention. He said this in a roundabout way. He insisted that NIH had not been doing any gun safety prevention work since 1996. He was probably referring to the CDC, and in fact, the CDC resumed funding gun violence prevention work in 2020. Someone earlier mentioned Project 2025. Trump has distanced himself from it. It's worth knowing that Project 2025 would allow states to use federal money to arm teachers. It calls for concealed carry reciprocity legislation so that if your next door neighbor state allows people to carry guns without a permit and conceal them, you'd be covered in the state that you lived in. It promotes stand your ground laws and more police officers. So all of this might sound to you like a pretty bleak picture. But I do think there are some cause for optimism. And first and foremost, as Josh said, don't forget the states. I would point to Florida. Florida used to be called the gunshine state. It had been a long time haven for gun rights. It was easy to obtain permits for concealed weapons. They had stand your ground laws in Florida. And after the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, which I actually covered as a national correspondent, state lawmakers did not pass any gun restrictions or legislation. But in the wake of the Parkland school shooting, Rick Scott, a Republican governor who is now senator, signed a red flag bill, an extreme risk protection order bill, less than 4 weeks after that shooting. A couple of years ago, I did some reporting in Florida. I went to a school where there had been a threat. Some kid had promised he was going to shoot up the school, and another kid reported it, and that student's guns were confiscated, and he was later actually I charged with violating that order. So it seemed like he was serious, and that a mass shooting was probably averted. The second thing I would remind you is that the gun lobby is weak right now. The NRA is kind of a shell of its former self. It went through all these lawsuits after the executive director, Wayne LaPierre, was accused of misappropriating money. So it's not the behemoth that it used to be. Third, the CDC is again funding research, and you have that money, as was mentioned, from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And then finally, the public is listening. And we know that American parents especially, are very worried about sending their kids to school. More than half the country, according to Gallup, thinks that gun laws should be more strict. And I pulled a poll here that I want to read to you from. 87% of Americans support requiring criminal background checks on all gun buyers, including 83% among gun-owning households. 81% of Americans support improving enforcement of existing gun laws. 81% support raising the legal age to buy a gun to 21, including 76% of gun-owning households. And this was not an MSNBC poll or some liberal or, advocacy group. This was a poll from Fox News. And this is what it found. And we know that, and this is sad to say, but at some point in his presidency, likely sooner than later, Trump is going to have to confront a mass shooting. And if I were in the gun violence prevention business, I would right now be studying everything he has ever said about gun violence to see if you can appeal to the side of him that is not captured by special interests, the side that was willing to sign the First Step Act into law. I would also note that he's not running again. He can't run for a third term, at least not unless he overturns the Constitution, which so far hasn't happened. So he's free to do something to upset his base and to upset the special interests. And while gun policy is made in the states, Trump sets the tone for the party. And, we've got a lot of Republican governors in this state. We're roughly split half and half. I want to be Pollyanna-ish. I don't think that it will be easy to persuade Republicans like Trump and others to come along. In fact, Rick Scott, the same Rick Scott who signed the ERPO bill into law, voted against the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022. But I am saying that I think you shouldn't stop trying. I'll end on this. Jonathan Metzl, who studies gun violence prevention at Vanderbilt University, has said that until the left understands gun culture, no progress can be made. And by the left, I think he means not only politicians, but also academia, and perhaps in particular, public health people. And I think Metzl makes a smart point. People on the left might say, well, why do we have to understand their gun culture? Why can't they understand that we don't want to send our kids to school and worry that, they're going to be gunned down by a crazy, guy with an assault weapon? But we do have the Second Amendment in this country. We have a Supreme Court that issued the Bruen ruling, as several of you have mentioned, and we have more guns than people. So talk of banning assault weapons, as Kamala Harris did during her campaign, I think, is not really going to fly. It's not going to get you anywhere. So I think, as always, the challenge is to find common ground, evidence-based policies. We know already from the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that this is possible. I wrote a story there that Dr. Swanson might remember, since his picture was plastered all over the pages of the New York Times with it, that said researchers viewed that law as a glass half full. So I would say that your challenge now is to come up with another glass half full. I'll leave it at that.
That's terrific.
I hope I came in under time.
A doctor, two lawyers, two social scientists, and a newspaper reporter walk into a bar. Okay, so let's talk. What I'd like to do is just circle back around, and not in any particular order, and let each of you react to what you've heard. And let's talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up our discussion to some questions from our audience, curated by Jennifer Melton. Anybody like to respond? Cami, go ahead.
Good. Well, I think a lot of us have talked about the federal, the money, all of the resources that have been poured into gun violence prevention, particularly over the last several years. And again, I am thinking about, so what happens if those funds dry up? What do we do? And I've in other contexts, I've explored the same question when thinking about police accountability and federal responses and federal intervention for police accountability. And it's just the response is always that, well, the states and the local government are going to have to step up to do these things. I think what's different here, or what gives me a little little pause here is that and I think that's great, right? Because local communities know best how to find the responses that are tailored, that they can tailor responses to the particular needs of their community. I know, for example, in Durham's doing some wonderful things, right? So I just think that, but what do we do in terms of the funding for this experimentation, right? We talk about states being the great labs of experiment, and I think that's true. And there are things that we can do, and there are, for example, I know Milwaukee, I'm a huge fan of the concept of these homicide review commissions that really take into account, you have the law enforcement, public health, social services, all of those folks kind of wrapping around and figuring out and studying this incident to figure out how they could prevent a similar one or another one from happening. And studies show that those things work. There have been decreases, or at least there's a correlation. There have been decreases in gun violence in areas that have those. So I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has a response to, now, so what are we going to tell? How are we going to tell states and local communities how to work in this area if there is likely not going to be the federal funding that we think?
Yeah. Good question. Josh, perhaps you want to take that one, or
Yeah, I
you
mean,
said you had a number
I
of
think
other
there's two answers to this. One is
Yeah.
that you're never going to replace all the federal funding. That just there's nothing that can, if the federal funding goes away, it's the scale of what they can do, right, is very difficult to replicate. I will say that governors, mayors, county commissioners, when they put their finger in the air and say, am I going to get reelected? The number one thing they're looking at is violence in their community, crime in their community. And what I would say to them is that if you want to be able to get reelected, but also do the right thing and save lives, let's keep that, is that you need to think about throughout your system where I can invest and where I can do where I can focus on implementation with the dollars that I have, right? There's a whole other discussion about private philanthropy that I hope that they will step up as well. But thinking carefully, taking the idea of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, there's more state offices, and we should have local offices. We're thinking through, where can I make my resources most efficient? And I'm going to go back to the idea, for instance, of implementing firearm removal processes, right? Where if you have the resources to do that, you're going to save lives, and that could be through domestic violence prevention orders, that can be protective orders, that can be extreme risk protection orders. That can be also thinking about how you invest your money within your own community. Are you doing it in ways where we now have research shows that will actually help community violence intervention? There's lots of ways to spend money, and many are worthy. But if you're focused on violence prevention, what are the dollars? How do I allocate my dollars in a way that makes sense? And what Kimmy mentioned, the Homicide Review Commission, now we call it Violence Reduction Councils, is spending your money wisely. Taking a look at the homicides and violent crime in your community, bringing all the folks who impact that together, not trying to solve one crime, looking at the pathways to violence. How do people get involved in the first place? And then developing policies based on that work that you've done together with your community, because that's a way where you invest your resources smartly. So it's partly volume. We're going to need more money from the states and locals, but it's also, how do I deploy the resources that I have in a way that's effective to stopping violence? And there's some really good materials out there and practices, but you got to look for them and you got to employ them.
I think
Mark?
I mentioned a couple of things, Jeff, and again, thank my fellow panelists. I think that these discussions have been wonderful. Two numbers I want to mention. One picks up on what Cami said, and that is the ratio of young Black men to young white men, 19 to 24, who are murdered with a gun. When I started working on this problem 40 years ago, I thought it was absolutely outrageous because the ratio was 8 to 1. And just to put this in perspective, if maternal mortality for Black women is twice as high as it is for white women, we can't stand that. We need to look at that right away and correct that. And here you had a ratio that was 8-1. That was 40 years ago. It's no longer the case. The ratio now is 20-1. The risk that a young Black man faces of being murdered with a gun is 20 times as high as the rate of a young white man. To me, this is such a social injustice that needs immediate attention. I don't think people understand that number. Another number I want to bring out is when I started working on this 40 years ago, there were 100 million guns in this country. And now there are 400 million guns. 400, 4 times as many guns. And what it means is that those things, those policies, those practices, those beliefs that people thought would protect them 40 years ago don't work now. When there are 4 times as many guns around, the policies and interventions that used to work don't. We need a rethinking of this. We need to approach this. Legislators need to approach this. And finally, I just want to say that we have become so polarized as a society that we forgot that we share a common overriding goal, that gun rights people share that goal with the gun control people. And that is to keep our kids from being killed, to keep our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers from being killed. We have the same goal. We have the same goal. And if we can come back to that, the cultural exchange that Cheryl mentioned, that I think is really important, we need to start talking to each other about how do we get to the common goal. Because one problem with the culture now is we see the enemy, not the death of our children, but we see the enemy as the other side. And we totally forget what our goal is. I think if we can bring that back and recognize we have that common goal. That's why Jay Dickey told me, he said, Mark, every time you talk about this, you have to remind people we're not about taking their guns away. If that's not your goal, Mark, say it. Start the conversation like that and get to your common goal. Listen, try to understand, and go from there. I think that's what made Jay optimistic. That's what gives me a sense of optimism and change.
I want to follow up on that because that statistic that you mentioned, Cami, was very startling to me. I mean, I'm putting my reporter's hat on now, and I immediately thought, okay, that's a story, right? Like we spent all this time during COVID talking about racial disparities. We spent time, as Mark just said, I've written about disparities in maternal mortality. And we talk about disparities in mass incarceration and also in Black people being victims of police violence. But it's so that I think is very important. And I think that, that's actually a message to just get out to reporters. I mean, if you want to change things, you can sometimes have to use the media. A couple of other things jumped out at me. One is what Josh said about the courts. It occurs to me that a lot, when people don't like who's in office, they often try to make an end run around who's in office by using the courts. And, I'm just wondering, and maybe this is already happening, if groups, advocacy groups are filing lawsuits, and perhaps friendly federal courts, if they can find any, to change policy that way, especially Josh, if you're saying that the Supreme Court maybe feels it went a little too far in Bruin. I don't know. We've got a lot of Republican appointed judges out there, a lot of Trump appointed judges, but that's a thought. And then my third thought is about what Mark said about the unified theory. Trump is a law and order guy. There's going to be a lot of lock 'em up talk. And it seems to me that if the public health people and the criminal justice people could get together and talk to one another, that might be very beneficial. And I know that's what you're trying to do here, but if you could do that in a bigger way, especially in a climate where, where we're going to hear a lot of talk about putting people away, locking people up, etc. Those are my thoughts.
Phil, do you have a comment on along those lines?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm all in favor of locking them up. And I think that it is key to a successful gun violence prevention program. But I wanted to respond to Cami in that regard, who was talking about one response, which is to increase the severity of penalties and to just make clear that my interest here is not to longer prison sentences. It's a greater chance of arrest and conviction. And that's, I think that all of our science says that the deterrent effect is much greater from changing the likelihood of punishment than it is from increasing the length of the prison sentence. And that it's largely futile to say we're going to put people in prison for 40 years instead of 20 years. That's not the story here. It is to say we have to go from less than 10%, which is where we are right now for shooters, to something that more closely approximates justice, and it needs to be taken into account by anyone who is considering shooting another person. So that's the distinction. It's not to lock them up in the sense of let's lock them up and throw away the key. It is, let's make sure that the police have the resources that they need and the focus that they need to take gun violence seriously, find ways to work with the community to improve cooperation, and increase that arrest and conviction rate to something that is going to be more effective.
Thank you. So before we go to some questions in the chat, just a comment. What occurs to me is, the role of culture is really significant here, and it's both. You can conceive it as part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And I was struck by the statistics that Cheryl was citing from the just public opinion about various kinds of gun regulations and so on. And it strikes me that, if you could legislate and do policy just based on public opinion, we would have a red flag law in every single state. The problem is we'd have universal comprehensive background checks. The problem is, you ask someone on a public opinion poll, do you favor, when someone goes to buy a gun from a licensed dealer, that they should have to have a background check just to prove that they're eligible, right? Everybody thinks that's a good idea, across the board. Then you ask on the same questionnaire a couple of pages later, you say, well, the United States Senate voted on that, and your senator voted against background checks. Do you agree with what your senator, how that senator voted? And you'd think that those two questions would be correlated. You could predict the answer to the second one from the first one, but you can't. It's a different question. The second one is really about, what tribe you belong to. And it's, that's where, and same thing happened in North Carolina, lots of support for a red flag law or ERPO law. But every time it's proposed in a legislature that's controlled by Republicans, it takes about 24 hours to go to the committee of no return, and we don't get it. And so, culture is really important. And part of this also goes back to I think, Mark's example with regard to automobile safety. The goal, or at least maybe an unintended but positive benefit of those car safety laws, like seatbelts in cars, has been to change how people behave and think about it. People you don't get in your car and put your seatbelt on because, hey, there's a law. No, you do it because now it's just natural. Everybody does that. But how do we go from, a common goal, people don't want their kids to be killed, to address the divide between, a large proportion of the country thinks, yes, we have a problem with gun violence, and big part of the solution is we need more guns in the hands of more people to protect ourselves. We had, millions of new gun owners in COVID, more than we had before. So there is a divide in worldview and how people think about it, and the symbolic, role of guns. And just quickly, I was interviewed on CNN by Victor Blackwell, who quoted to me a comment by an Alabama legislator who said the problem we have with guns in this country is not the guns; it's a moral deficit. We have a moral deficit, and he asked me, "Do you think that that the problem is a moral deficit?" And to which I responded, "Well, it doesn't make sense that Alabama would have a moral deficit 10 times more than New York, because they have 10 times the gun fatality rate in Alabama than New York." That wasn't his point. But my point is, if you think about the variation across states in the features of this problem, how serious it is and what's being done, there's a lot of lessons to learn there. And a lot of it, I think, does have to do with thinking about how we understand these different cultures. So with that, maybe we can take up some of these topics, but let me turn to Jennifer, and you could throw us a couple of questions from our audience if you have some, and we'll go from there. Thank you all. This is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think we have time for a few audience questions before we have time. To the culture question, one of the questions was asking what the panelists think about how people within gun culture can be important conversation problems and finding new synergies for problem solving.
So Josh, let me ask you to address that. I mean, it's one you thought about a lot.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I've written about this, I've thought about it, and there's no one gun culture, right? So there are people who support Second Amendment advocacy groups, and they feel one way. There are people who are sport shooters who feel another way, and people who are what I call home defenders. But I can tell you, among my colleagues, right, in public health, there are gun owners in within the center that I work in. My co-director is very public about her gun ownership, and she's sport shooting and home defense. And the culture that I think of, so there's many cultures, but there's one that's, I think, extremely important, which is a culture of safety and security. And I think working along with that is very interesting. And I think you're starting to see the synergies there, because in Michigan, when parents gave their troubled son a firearm, for the first time, you saw a jury convict them of failing to secure their firearms. And I think that's actually a convergence of cultures there, of norms. And I think we have to stop thinking about gun culture one way, gun violence prevention the other way. There's a lot of overlap already. There's a lot of overlap among both sides, there's not sides on this really. There's a lot of overlap in practice, and thinking about how we find those people who can build that culture. And that's, I think, something that's going on that's not noticed right now. 10 years ago, district attorneys who talked about prosecuting parents were kicked out of office, were kicked out of office. Now it's a norm. Seen the same thing in Atlanta. So I think you're actually seeing more convergence, and I'm hopeful that we'll see a culture that merges from multifaceted around safety and security of firearms.
I would add briefly that I believe Giffords, the organization founded by Gabrielle Giffords, has an initiative to work with gun owners.
And I think in terms of the interventions that appeal to both sides, we have many. One is the red flag laws, or ERPOs. And I want to give credit to you, Jeff, and to you, Josh, two people who did the extraordinary pioneering work on these. But they basically say, if you have someone who is about to shoot someone, if you have someone who's about to shoot themselves, you can get the court to temporarily take the gun essentially out of their hands. That doesn't interfere with the rights of people who are abiding by the law and keeping their guns. It doesn't take them away from law-abiding gun owners. It intervenes at the critical point when you can save lives. So there are other things too, uniform background checks, domestic violence laws, safe storage, saves lives without infringing on the rights of law-abiding gun owners. And I think we need to get that story out. And I think that the media can help us get that story out. that there are a whole set of interventions and increasing numbers of them that can serve both cultures in their overriding ends. One last point I wanted to make about the media, and Cheryl, maybe you can help us do better with that, is that a lot of times they have a story about a homicide, a gun homicide, but they don't explain any of the background. They don't explain the setting, or they typically show, here are 350 people who were killed in Atlanta last year. And there's no analysis, there's no focus. What are the patterns? What can we learn from this? How can we make this a problem that we can solve rather than a problem that just makes us gasp and cringe back in fear? And I think newspapers cover school shootings inordinately. They give them a lot of attention and publicity. It's not just newspapers, Cheryl. I shouldn't focus on papers.
Okay.
Papers are probably better than TV and the media, but they are 1% of the gun deaths, and they probably get 90% of the coverage. And people who want to get coverage for their last act know this. So we attract people to the schools in
Well-
part by the way we cover them. I think
Yeah.
we can do better in many places.
I would just
Well,
say,
newspapers are now about 1% of the information people consume too.
Yeah,
So,
that's
Cheryl,
true,
do you
too.
have a comment there? And then we should go to another question.
I'll just keep it brief because we're short on time. First, I would say it's incumbent upon people like you, Mark, when you see a story like that, call the reporter, say, hey, you know what? Let's put this into context. I see another story here. And reporters are only as good as their sources. And we have had, quite a number of debates within the newspaper business, within journalism, about whether to name people who who commit mass shootings, and that is very difficult. It's a difficult decision. On the one hand, the public deserves to know who this person is. If the New York Times doesn't name the person, it doesn't really matter because everybody else is naming them. But we are mindful that people want to get attention for their acts, and I think we do try to balance that as best we can. I'm not aware that we have a policy about that at the Times, but it's been a discussion through journalism.
Jennifer, can you give us another question from the audience?
Sure. There's a question here about disinformation or misinformation. It talked about that there was a lot going on in this past campaign to convince voters that crime had massively increased under the Biden administration. And so to all the panelists, how do you plan on tackling disinformation about guns going forward?
Cammie, do you want to take that one to start with?
Yeah, well, I think that again, it's like what someone already said. It's like, well, where are people getting their information, and is it reliable? And I mean that is just a larger question that, if we could solve that, right? It's like it happens with gun violence, but it's happened in so many other contexts as well. What I am grateful for, and when I think about this panel and what Mark was saying about the unified theory of gun violence prevention, is that, again, if we are all, whether it's from, law, medicine, public health, media, if we are all kind of saying the same things, right? And that this is, it is a complicated problem, and there are many different ways in which to approach it, and we need to come together and not compete with each other, because I think that's where you get, I don't know if it's the misinformation, but you do get different factions competing. No, this is the best way to solve it. No, it's this way. And really, I think it's going to take all of us from our various perspectives. And one thing, and I think it relates to the question, is because when we're thinking about media and different sound bites, and I mentioned that statistic about how much more likely Black men are to be killed. And then immediately someone can hear that, and immediately it can become, oh, well, because they just must be more prone to violence. And we are not taking time to say, well, wait a minute, have you thought about the education in that community, the built environment in this community, the access to jobs and things like that. And we do that when we're thinking about maternal mortality and racial disparities there, but we need to do those same things here. I think it's a really complex problem because it is so complicated, and in our society, we're just not ready and able all the time to digest all of the things that we need to. We want a soundbite, and this is just something that can't be, can't be enveloped in one soundbite.
Jennifer, give us one more question, and then I'm going to direct everybody to maybe make a final comment.
I think this was mentioned earlier about sort of states' response, but this question is asking about many in the gun violence prevention community are preparing for the incoming administration to weaken the ATF. In response, some organizations are urging states to implement state licensing for arms dealers. What other measures can states and organizations take to protect citizens and states' rights to control firearms?
So thinking about that question, and let's incorporate that into sort of a final little lightning round where I'd like to give everyone a chance to just say something by way of summary or a takeaway. You can answer that question or another one, and then we'll have to wrap up. I think we could take another hour to talk about all this. So anyway, Josh, go ahead. It looked like you were going to answer that question.
Well, on the policy front, firearm purchase or licensing saves lives. It's easy. It's preventative. It doesn't increase incarceration, and it's one of those pieces that actually saves lives across homicide, suicide, reduces police violence. It's something that's widely supported in the polls. So I would do that. That's I think the state should be focused on. The second thing is I'm very lucky to work for the #1 school of public health in the country. And our center is amazing, the Center for Gun Violence Solutions. And every year we analyze the CDC data and we look at homicide, firearm homicide, suicide, and other deaths. If you want objective data, it takes a little bit while to get that data, but we do a really good job of putting it into really good context. Take your time, take a look at our website, and take a look at that material, and that will give you the most objective view of firearm death that we know of.
Do you want a very quick plug for the licensing report since you just mentioned that?
Yes, we will be having a firearm purchase or licensing report will come out in early January. It's a partnership between my center and the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, and it has all the tools you need to understand licensing and how important it is.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Phil, you have some benediction for us?
This is the popcorn moment. Yeah, so let me return to the beginning and just say that I think it's very important that the police and the courts not drop out of the conversation about prevention, that they are first responders in the case of the police to the bulk of all shootings, and what they do matters. And it matters not only in terms of justice, but also in terms of preventing subsequent shootings. It should be part of our conversation and part particularly of the public health conversation about gun violence.
Thank you. Mark, Dr. Rosenberg.
Well, again, my thanks to you, Jeff, for bringing the wonderful panelists together on this. I would say we need to avoid dichotomous thinking, that it's either mental illness or immoral people, that it's either gun violence prevention or keeping your guns. It's not an either or world out there. And we're not going to make progress by finding the right answer. There is no one right answer. To use the absolute wrong phrase, there's no silver bullet that's going to keep us all safe. Yeah. It's going to be incremental. It's going to take time. It's going to take compiling the evidence to know what works and what doesn't work. And I think we're making progress and will continue to make progress on all of these three fronts. So I'm optimistic that we don't have to live We're sending our kids to school to do active shooter drills 3 times a week. We will make progress. We'll get there. Hang in. And we need everybody. We need all of you out there listening, as well as every discipline represented on the panel.
Cammie, do you have something for us that could fit on the fortune cookie, maybe, or a little bit?
Fortune cookie. Yeah, yes, I'm grateful for the conversation, and I agree with what Phil said, and just in terms of we need law enforcement at the table. It's just how are they at the table and how are they showing up, and we need the dollars for research, because there are folks who there are some answers to these questions and the trends and the patterns, and we need to continue that research and folks working on that.
And Cheryl Gay Stolberg.
I would also say I'm grateful to have participated in the panel, and I would offer you something that I've learned in my reporting career. This can fit on a fortune cookie, and that is that listening is more important than talking. And I think that we, as Mark said, we all have to listen to one another. If it's anything I've learned in reporting my book, it's that, when people come together and have civil conversations, we can have progress. I know it's hard, but listening is more important than talking.
Well, thank you all very much. I will leave you with just one thing. For those of you who might enjoy a fine glass of wine, you think where that came from, and it invokes the metaphor of a vineyard, and lots of people working in different sectors of the vineyard, doing different tasks. But it's all connected, and leads to, hopefully, over the long run, just to a fine result. And I couldn't thank you more. This has been extremely informative for me, and personally gratifying. All of you are my friends, and thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for attending our webinar today. Thanks very much. Goodbye.